Over the years, many games have ended up burdened with overwhelming expectations prior to release. Games labeled as Halo killers for the PS2 and PS3 come to mind almost immediately. But the idea that some console is finally getting something worthy of comparison with another competitor's offerings goes back much further than that, though. And with Quest 64, we're looking at a game that unfortunately had a lot of hopes riding on it. When Square bailed on the N64 in favor of making games for the PS1, lured over to Sony's new console by its ability to hold better music and video in its much larger CD-ROMs, Nintendo had lost its biggest source of RPGs, and the N64, up until this point, hadn't got a single one. As such, people were looking to Quest 64 as the sort of savior of the genre on N64, which was always way too much to put on this game in particular. And as a result, I've come to think that this game is at least slightly, but certainly not entirely, unfairly maligned, and deserves a second look, at least on the right terms. I had always gotten the impression that Quest 64 was, in short, an absolutely awful trash fire for many years. That seemed to be its reputation. In recent years, though, it feels like the narrative has been shifting a little bit, and while some parts of this game are certainly still pretty bad, going in with incredibly low expectations, I found that there are still some surprisingly bright spots as well. The opening of the game, like a lot of very old school RPGs, contains what amounts to the entire story, excepting some weird scattered bits that were clearly leftovers, and it just immediately dumps on you the moment you get in through the menus and start a new game. It turns out you're going to find your father, and this priest doesn't want you to risk your life to do so, but you have to do what you have to do, and you're off on your adventure. This is the very obvious first immediate example of how, in its own weird way, Quest 64 really feels like it's an NES RPG stuck out of time. SNES RPGs had already dramatically improved this formula, but Quest 64 doesn't just seem like a single generation out of time, but two. In just about every single realm except for two: the graphics and the combat. When it comes to the graphics, while they look incredibly dated these days, they were singled out at the time as somewhat impressive in previews and even some reviews that were otherwise quite harsh. However, once the game was released, it became very clear that the places where those graphics were actually put together into impressive scenes were few and far between. There are certainly some cities scattered across the map that are pretty impressive when you're in them, though that does often come at the cost of frame rate, but the vast majority of your 15 or so hours in this game are going to be spent in incredibly drab dungeons or overworld maps with very little in the way of decoration or variety. And that isn't the only way the game very much marks itself as an early 3D game, though. Its camera is also very much of a specific time when developers were still trying to figure out how to deal with these newfangled 3D games, and basically requires you to keep holding the B button almost constantly anywhere you're going in order to keep the camera from doing some really wild stuff when you leave it to its own devices. Of the game's sins, though, this is certainly a lesser one, and it's a sin you'll be dealing with in a lot of retro games because it shares it with so many other games that came out in the same time. In general, no matter where you are, it's not like anything you're seeing is particularly exciting. There is heavy reuse where buildings and rooms are largely identical between different towns. Huge areas where there's almost nothing inside a room. The overworld is basically just a giant open area with scattered random battles too. Frankly, these are just a few of the ways in which the game can often feel incredibly unfinished. You'll find yourself in new locations with absolutely no through line, or explanation. You'll find scattered bits of an old abandoned plot just sitting around in the world waiting to talk to you. And whether it was a conscious choice or not, the game also has no currency, which means you only get the items that you find scattered around, making finding those, as well as using them judiciously, incredibly important. And that brings us neatly to the other element of this game that actually works to some extent, the combat. Much like just about any other turn-based RPG of its era, Quest 64 is incredibly reliant on random battles that occur far too frequently in what can feel like sometimes you go 2 steps between every battle. But unlike most of those other games, the battles still take place in the world itself. Once the battle starts, you'll be exactly where you were when the battle was triggered, and will be able to move around within the space you were just in, limited by the distance you can move in a turn to run away to the edges of the dynamic combat arena to escape, or just put distance between yourself and your enemy. Even that turn-based movement adds a interesting new element not present in many of its contemporaries. But the game also gives you a split second after an enemy attacks to dodge it, though some are much more dodgeable than others. When the battle is over, you pick up your journey in the exact spot you were in at the end of the battle, a level of continuity that is very nice, especially for the time. What little story there is focuses very heavily on the power of magic, so it seems apt that the spells are basically the entire focus of the combat as well. These spells are entirely element-based, and the entire game revolves around your ability to find spirits out in the world to level up your elements, or alternatively, grind them out through leveling. Then, make the best use of them in the very positioning-centric combat, which not only allows you to avoid enemy attacks or escape, but is also required in order to make sure your spells are going to actually hit. Something else that is just as important is picking which of the 4 elements that make up the combat system that you should focus on. There seems to be general agreement that you should pretty much always take water as one of your stats. It gives you healing, which allows you to ignore the healing items much more effectively than you can otherwise, but the other element you take is more or less a difficulty switch. Picking wind is the easiest, earth is sort of medium, and picking fire is hard. I should of course mention that earth does allow you to do some pretty cheesy strategies, but those are only really needed near the end of the game, where you'll have spare points to put into earth anyway. At best, in a normal playthrough, you're going to be able to pick up 3 of the 4 elements by the end of the game and get them to max. So there's a very limiting factor there, and if you make the mistake of starting to level a non-optimal element, you'll either have a much more difficult late game, or be required to do a ton of incredibly boring grinding to get the handful of abilities you'll actually make use of, since most of the spells the game gives you are pretty useless outside a few. An even less successful swing the game makes with its combat is that each turn the enemies have, only one of them in a given group attacks at once. This means, unlike a lot of other turn-based RPGs, there's not really much in the way of a consistent reason to prioritize enemies. This isn't really something I had thought of before as a strategy element of turn-based RPGs, but it takes a surprising amount of that strategy away. Sure, there still might be a reason to wipe out specific enemies because they have some devastating ability that you want to take off the board entirely, but if you just encounter a group of 5 identical monsters, something this game is throwing at you constantly, there is absolutely zero reason to prioritize any given one of them. It is at the very least an odd choice, and I honestly think in some more egregious cases was actively harmful to my enjoyment of the moment-to-moment gameplay. There is at least one bit of a forgiving element in how it handles saves, however, because the game returns you to the last save with all of your earned XP intact when you die out in the world. Honestly, without that, I would have given up this game a long time before I finished it, especially early on. But being able to dust yourself off and pick yourself up without having a bunch of wasted time directly in your rear view, it goes a long way. That being said, between the sometimes required grinding, the constant random encounters, and the often extremely repetitive monster group configurations within those encounters, getting rid of the frustration entirely is just not going to happen. And with absolutely no interesting plot to speak of driving you forward through the rougher spots, and the tiny promising sprinklings of a plot seemingly left over from some earlier draft that was never finished due to running out of time, it is incredibly easy to burn out trying to get through this game to the end, even with a guide holding your hand through the nonsensical order of progression through the world. So, is Quest 64 worth playing today? At least a little bit. I think so. I could sit here all day talking about the frustrating and annoying parts of this game because they leave an extremely lasting impression. It does some really fascinating things with its combat that are at least worth a look, but it grows incredibly tedious by the end in a way that is absolutely no fun at all, and has plenty of issues, even well before you hit that point. So this is one of those games, frankly, I think you should just play until you stop having fun, or perhaps a while after you never start having fun. The game does not get dramatically better the later on you get in it. There is no shock twist. If you feel like you've seen enough, you should trust that instinct, because you've almost certainly seen enough. But if you're resilient, you may get to see a lot more of the game than a lot of other people, and I do think there is something there that is worth looking at.